Hey folks, I know I am just an old guy telling stories, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's stories. Before I dive into today's stories, I want to say, disclaimer. The content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. Okay, so let me start by saying that I'm not the type of person who regularly dabbles in sketchy corners of the internet. I don't mess with scams, I don't snoop where I don't belong, and I definitely don't have a death wish. But every now and then, I get curious about things, like really curious. And I'm the type of person who, once I find a rabbit hole, I just keep digging until I hit the bottom. That's exactly how this all started. I was home alone a couple of months ago, scrolling through Reddit like I always do. Nothing unusual, just jumping from meme threads to random AMA posts. At some point, I ended up in a subreddit about creepy internet mysteries. I won't name it here because it's way too niche, and I don't want people trying to follow my footsteps. Anyway, someone in the comments mentioned the dark web. Now, I've heard of the dark web, obviously. I mean, who hasn't? It's that mysterious part of the internet where people imagine hackers and criminals lurking 24/7. But that's not the whole truth. It's really just a collection of websites that don't show up on Google or regular browsers. You need special software like the Tor browser to access them. So out of pure boredom, and yeah, maybe a little curiosity, I decided to download Tor. I didn't think I'd actually find anything. I was expecting most of it to just be broken links or spam. But after about an hour of poking around, I stumbled across a forum. It didn't look like much, just plain text on a black background. The site was called something generic like Hidden Files Exchange, and it was full of people trading random documents and links to weird websites. I wasn't planning on staying long. I was just scrolling out of curiosity when a post caught my eye. The title said, "Forgotten WW1 Research Facility, Coordinates Enclosed." It wasn't flashy or anything, just a short paragraph describing some kind of abandoned underground laboratory that supposedly dated back to World War I. The post mentioned that it had been used for secret government experiments, specifically ones involving things like telekinesis, hypnosis, and mind control. Apparently, the facility had been hidden away in a remote area and was left to rot when the experiments were deemed unsuccessful. There were no photos or proof, just a vague description and a set of GPS coordinates. The whole thing screamed fake, but it intrigued me. The idea of uncovering some forgotten piece of history, something straight out of a conspiracy theory, felt too tempting to ignore. Plus, I've always had this weird fascination with old abandoned places. There's something eerie, but fascinating about them, you know? The thing that really sealed the deal for me was that the location wasn't too far from where I lived. I won't give exact details, but let's just say it was somewhere deep in the woods, about 3 hours away from my small town. It was close enough that it felt like an adventure, but far enough to make it feel like I was stepping out of my comfort zone. I copied the coordinates and pasted them into Google Maps. The spot was marked as a dense patch of forest in the middle of nowhere. There were no roads leading in, just miles of trees. I almost laughed at myself for even considering it. Who just drives out into the woods based on some random post on a dark web forum? But then again, I wasn't doing anything that weekend. The next couple of days were spent obsessively researching the area. I couldn't find anything on the facility itself, no historical records, no news articles, nothing. But the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that maybe that was the point. If this place was so secret, it made sense that there wouldn't be any public information about it. By Friday, I had made up my mind. I told myself it was just a day trip, nothing serious. I packed a flashlight, my phone, a portable charger, some snacks, and a bottle of water. I even downloaded an offline map of the area on my phone just in case I lost signal in the woods. I set out early Saturday morning. The drive itself was uneventful, just a straight shot on the highway, until I reached a smaller winding road that led toward the forest. The closer I got, the more isolated everything felt. There were fewer cars, fewer houses. By the time I reached the GPS coordinates, I was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. I parked my car on the side of the road, grabbed my stuff, and started walking. The trail wasn't marked, but it was there, a narrow path cutting through the dense trees. The air was damp and the forest was eerily quiet. I walked for what felt like forever, occasionally checking my phone to make sure I was heading in the right direction. Eventually, I came across something that didn't belong, a rusted metal door embedded in the side of a hill. It was covered in moss and barely visible against the greenery. If I hadn't been looking for it, I probably would have walked right past it. The door didn't have a handle, just a small circular hole where one might have been at some point. I pushed on it, and to my surprise, it swung open with an awful creak. Behind it was a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. At this point, I should have turned back, I know that, but the curiosity was too much to ignore. I took out my flashlight, stepped inside, and started descending. The air grew colder as I went deeper, and the sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls. The stairs eventually ended, opening up into a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were made of concrete, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust so thick I could see my footprints. There were no signs, no markings, nothing to tell me what this place was. Just silence and darkness. I walked down the hallway, peeking into the rooms on either side. Most of them were empty, just small, windowless spaces with rusted metal furniture and broken equipment. But then I found something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a large room filled with old machines, the kind you'd expect to see in a science fiction movie. There were metal chairs with restraints on the armrests, strange devices with wires and dials, and a massive console covered in switches and buttons. I walked up to one of the machines and wiped the dust off the surface. The words engraved on it were in German, which made sense given the World War I connection. I don't speak German, but I recognized some of the words from online translators, things like Gedankensteuerung, mind control, and hypnosis. The creepiness of the place was starting to get to me. I thought about turning back, but then I noticed something on the far side of the room, a filing cabinet. It was half open with papers spilling out of it. I walked over and started rifling through the documents. Most of them were faded and completely unreadable, but one caught my attention. It had a diagram of a human brain, along with handwritten notes in German. The only words I could make out were telekinesis, and control. I don't know why, but I decided to take the paper with me. It felt like proof that this place was real, that it wasn't just some elaborate prank. I was about to leave when I noticed another door at the back of the room. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it was another staircase leading even further down. I don't know what I was expecting when I opened that second door, but it wasn't this. The staircase behind it was much narrower than the first, with metal steps that creaked under my weight. It spiraled downward for what felt like forever, the air growing heavier with each step. My flashlight flickered once and I nearly dropped it in panic. The thought of being stuck down there in complete darkness was enough to make me reconsider the whole thing. But I pressed on, gripping the flashlight like my life depended on it. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a smaller corridor. The air down there was noticeably colder, with a faint metallic smell that reminded me of rust, or maybe old machinery. The walls were different too, no longer bare concrete. They were lined with strange panels like they were built to house wiring or ventilation systems. This part of the facility felt more advanced than the upper levels, almost futuristic in a way, despite how old everything clearly was. There were more rooms branching off the corridor, but these weren't empty like the ones above. The first door I opened led to what looked like a laboratory. The tables were covered in glass beakers, metal trays, and what I could only describe as prototypes for medical equipment. Some of the tools looked vaguely familiar, like early versions of EEG machines or defibrillators, but others were completely alien to me. One device caught my attention in particular. It looked like a helmet, but it was connected to a web of wires that led into a box with dials and switches. I couldn't figure out what it was supposed to do, but the faint label on the side read something like Gedankenantrieb, another German word I didn't understand. I snapped a picture with my phone, thinking I could translate it later. The more I looked around, the more uneasy I felt. Not scared exactly, but there was this weird sensation that I wasn't supposed to be there, like I was intruding on something that had been forgotten for a reason. I moved to another room down the hall, this one locked with a rusted padlock. It didn't take much effort to break it off. The metal practically crumbled in my hands. Inside, I found what I can only describe as a storage room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty file boxes and stacks of old documents. There were jars of chemicals too, some with faded labels in German and others with symbols I didn't recognize. But what really stood out were the photographs. They were scattered across one of the shelves, black and white images that had clearly been taken decades ago. Most of the photos showed people sitting in those metal chairs I'd seen earlier, wires strapped to their heads or arms. Their expressions were blank, almost lifeless, and it was hard to tell if they were asleep or just unresponsive. A few of the photos had handwritten notes scrawled on the back, but the ink had smudged over time, making them almost impossible to read. The only clear word I could make out was Versuchspersonen, which I later found out means test subjects. I started going through one of the file boxes, hoping to find something in English, or at least something I could translate later. Most of it was technical jargon that went way over my head, but I did find a few documents with diagrams and charts that caught my eye. One of them showed what looked like a map of the human brain, with certain areas circled and labeled. Another had instructions for some kind of experiment, with words like telekinesis, and control, repeated over and over. I wasn't sure what any of it meant, but it was clear that this place had been dedicated to some kind of psychological or neurological research. Whether or not it had anything to do with superpowers like the forum post suggested, I couldn't say. But the more I read, the more I started to believe that the people running this facility had been way ahead of their time, like decades ahead. I spent a little too long in that room, snapping photos of anything that looked important. By the time I moved on, my phone battery was already down to 60%. I kept telling myself I'd leave soon, but every time I found something new, I felt like I was getting closer to uncovering the truth about this place. The last room I explored that day was by far the strangest. It was larger than the others, with rows of what looked like containment chambers along the walls. They reminded me of those cryopods you see in sci-fi movies, long metal tubes with glass fronts and control panels on the side. Most of them were empty, but a few were sealed shut with condensation fogging up the glass. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming need to see what was inside one of them. I wiped the fog from the glass of the nearest pod and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside was a mannequin, or at least, that's what I told myself at first. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were all wrong. The proportions were slightly off, like it had been sculpted by someone who had only a vague idea of what a person was supposed to look like. The longer I stared at it, the more details I noticed. Its skin was pale and waxy with faint lines that looked almost like veins running beneath the surface. Its eyes were closed, and its mouth was slightly open, revealing what looked like teeth. I don't know. It could have been some kind of medical dummy or an early attempt at creating an artificial human, but whatever it was, it gave me a bad feeling. I backed away from the pod, deciding I'd seen enough for one day. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a research facility. It was something much stranger. I made my way back up the staircase, through the upper levels, and out into the woods. By the time I reached my car, it was already starting to get dark. I drove home in silence, trying to process everything I'd seen. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, to pretend I'd never gone there. But another part of me knew I couldn't let it go. Not yet. I still had the photos, the documents, and that one nagging question that refused to leave my mind. What had they been trying to accomplish here? The next few days after I visited the facility were a blur. My brain felt like it was running on overdrive, trying to make sense of everything I'd seen. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange machines, the sealed pods, and especially the cryptic documents. I didn't tell anyone about the trip. I mean, how do you even start that conversation? Oh, hey, I spent my Saturday exploring a hidden lab from World War I. Want to see some creepy pictures? Yeah, no thanks. But the thing is, I couldn't just let it go. It felt like I'd stumbled onto something way bigger than myself, something that shouldn't have been forgotten. So I decided to dig deeper, but this time from the safety of my own home. The first thing I did was go through the photos on my phone. Most of them were just snapshots of the rooms and machines, but a few stood out. There was the diagram of the human brain, the strange German instructions, and of course, the image of that mannequin-like thing in the pod. I zoomed in on the writing wherever I could and started translating the words using Google Translate. Most of it was technical jargon that I didn't fully understand, but certain phrases kept popping up. Gedankenkontrolle, mind control, neurologische Manipulation, neurological manipulation, and übersinnliche Fähigkeiten, paranormal abilities. There was even a mention of psychokinetische Kriegsführung, which roughly translates to psychokinetic warfare. At this point, it started to click. Whoever had been running that facility wasn't just experimenting with human psychology, they were trying to weaponize it. The idea sounded ridiculous, like something out of a comic book, but the evidence was right there in front of me. These people had been trying to create soldiers with superhuman abilities. The more I translated, the more unsettling it became. One document mentioned something about Schwellenwert des Bewusstseins, a threshold of consciousness. It sounded like they were trying to push the human brain beyond its natural limits, but there were also notes about failures and irreversible consequences. I didn't want to think too hard about what that might mean. I spent hours on my computer, cross-referencing the words I found with anything I could dig up online. Most of the results led me to obscure scientific papers or conspiracy theory forums, but one link stood out. It was an old website archived on a dark web forum, buried under layers of unrelated posts. The site was basic, just white text on a black background, like the one where I'd first found the coordinates. But this one had a name, Project Gedankenschatten, Project Shadowmind. The website described an experimental program allegedly run during World War I by a coalition of scientists from several countries. Their goal, according to the site, was to unlock hidden potential in the human mind, abilities like telepathy, telekinesis, and enhanced memory. The idea was that these abilities could give soldiers an edge on the battlefield. But here's where it gets weird. The program supposedly went dark in the early 1920s. According to the site, all records of Project Shadowmind were erased and any remaining facilities were abandoned. Officially, the program was deemed a failure with no measurable results to show for years of experimentation. But unofficially, some people believed the experiments had gone too far, that the scientists had succeeded in ways they hadn't anticipated. At this point, I was way too deep into the rabbit hole to stop. I went back to the documents I'd taken from the facility, trying to match them with anything I could find on the website. Most of it was too fragmented to piece together, but a few things lined up, like the brain diagrams and the references to test subjects. Then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Buried in the text of one of the archived pages was a phrase I'd seen in the facility, Versuchspersonen, test subjects. According to the website, the facility I'd explored wasn't just a research lab. It was one of several testing sites where human volunteers were subjected to experiments designed to unlock their potential. I wish I could say that was the worst of it, but it wasn't. Another document I'd taken from the lab had a list of names, dates, and what I assumed were experiment numbers. I didn't recognize any of the names, but the dates were what stood out. Most of them were from the early 1900s, which made sense given the World War I connection. But there were a few dates that didn't add up, specifically ones from the 1940s and 50s. That didn't make sense. If the program had been shut down in the 1920s, why were there records from decades later? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe the program hadn't really been shut down. Maybe it had just changed names or gone deeper underground. The thought was unsettling, but it also explained why there was no public record of the facility I'd found. I spent the rest of the night trying to decipher more of the documents, but it was slow going. Most of the text was smudged or faded, and the German handwriting was hard to read. By the time I finally went to bed, my brain felt fried. The next morning, I woke up to a string of notifications on my phone. Apparently, one of the photos I'd taken, the one of the mannequin-like figure in the pod, had automatically uploaded to my cloud storage. I hadn't even realized it was synced. Worse, I'd accidentally shared it to a private album on Facebook. It only took a minute to delete the post, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might have seen it. Not because I was worried about people coming after me or anything, just because I didn't want to deal with questions. How do you even explain something like that without sounding crazy? After that, I decided to take a break. I'd spent enough time obsessing over the facility, and I needed to clear my head. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, more than I could uncover on my own. That's when I decided to reach out for help. After a few days of taking a step back, I realized something. I wasn't getting anywhere on my own. Sure, I'd translated some of the documents and pieced together bits of information, but I was still staring at a giant puzzle with half the pieces missing. That's when I decided to reach out to someone who might actually know what they were looking at. Now, I don't have some super genius scientist friend who specializes in secret government projects, but I do have a buddy, Evan, who's a bit of an internet sleuth. He's one of those people who can dig up information on just about anything. Need to find out what year a company went out of business? He's your guy. Curious about an abandoned place you drove past once? He'll pull up old blueprints, zoning records, and satellite images before you even finish describing it. The only problem? I wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding completely insane. So, I decided to ease into it. I texted him something like, "Hey man, quick question. How hard would it be to track down info on an old abandoned lab? Hypothetically speaking." He responded almost immediately. "Hypothetically? Or are you about to tell me you found some underground bunker in the middle of nowhere?" I swear, the guy knows me too well. After some back and forth, I decided to just spill the basics. No dark web, no specifics about where the facility was. I told him I'd found an old research site while hiking, a little white lie to make it sound less sketchy, and that I'd come across some documents I couldn't fully understand. To my surprise, he didn't question it too much. Instead, he asked me to send him photos of the documents and anything else I'd found. I hesitated at first, but then I figured, why not? Worst case, he'd think I was nuts. Best case, he'd help me figure out what this place actually was. A couple of hours later, Evan called me. "Okay, dude, you're either messing with me or you just stumbled onto something really weird," he said. He'd started digging into the German words from the documents and the terms I'd given him. Most of what he found lined up with what I already knew. References to experiments on telekinesis, mind control, and other paranormal abilities. But there was something else. Something I hadn't found in my own research. "Have you ever heard of the MK Ultra program?" he asked. I had vaguely. It was that CIA thing from the 1950s where they experimented with mind control techniques, right? I'd seen a documentary about it once, but I hadn't thought about it in years. "Well, here's the thing," Evan said. "Some people think MK Ultra wasn't the start of the program. It was just a continuation. Like, the US picked up where other countries left off after World War II. I didn't say anything, but my mind immediately went back to the dates I'd seen on those documents, the experiments in the 1940s and 50s. Could this facility have been one of the places where it all started? Evan must have noticed my silence because he kept going. I found a couple of mentions of something called Project Shadow Mind. It's pretty obscure, but it lines up with the stuff you sent me. Supposedly, it was an international effort during World War I to study psychic phenomena and enhanced mental abilities. It sounds like most of the records were destroyed, but there are rumors that some of the research got picked up by other countries later on. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, it felt good to know I wasn't completely crazy. This thing was real and I wasn't the only one who knew about it. But on the other hand, it just raised more questions. Who had been running the facility? Why had it been abandoned? And most importantly, what had happened to the people involved? Do you think any of it worked? I asked finally. Evan paused for a second. Hard to say. A lot of the stuff I've read makes it sound like it was just pseudoscience. People chasing something that didn't exist. But then again, if they really were experimenting on people, who knows? Maybe they did figure something out, and it just didn't work the way they wanted. That last part stuck with me. It reminded me of the photos I'd found in the lab. The test subjects strapped into those chairs, the sealed pods, the mannequin-like figure. What if it wasn't a mannequin? What if it was something else? Something left behind when the experiments went wrong? Evan said he'd keep digging and let me know if he found anything else. In the meantime, I decided to go back through the rest of the photos and documents, hoping I'd missed something important. That's when I remembered the encrypted files. When I first went through the papers, I'd come across a stack of pages filled with what looked like gibberish, random letters and symbols, almost like a code. I hadn't paid much attention to them at the time because I didn't think I'd be able to figure them out. But now, with Evan's help, I figured it was worth a shot. I sent him a few pictures of the encrypted documents, and within minutes, he was texting me back. "This is a cipher," he said. "It's old school, but I might be able to crack it. Give me a couple of hours." While I waited, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said earlier about MK Ultra and Project Shadow Mind. If the experiments had been going on for decades, how much had they really discovered? Were the rumors about psychic abilities and mind control just that, rumors? Or was there some truth to it? By the time Evan called me back, I was practically pacing my living room. "Okay, so I only cracked part of it," he said. "But it's weird. The text I translated keeps talking about a conduit." "A conduit for what?" I asked. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "The document makes it sound like the human brain is just a piece of a larger system, like a receiver or a bridge. It mentions something about external forces, like something outside of us that the brain is supposed to connect to. But it doesn't explain what those forces are." I didn't know what to say. The idea sounded crazy, but at the same time it kind of made sense. If the facility had really been trying to push the limits of human potential, maybe they'd been looking for a way to tap into something beyond our normal understanding of the world. "I think you need to go back," Evan said suddenly. "What? Why?" "Because there's more to this than what you found so far. I don't think you've seen everything that facility has to offer." I wasn't sure if I agreed, but a part of me couldn't help wondering if he was right. I didn't want to go back to the facility. I told myself it wasn't worth the risk. But after Evan cracked part of that cipher and mentioned the word conduit, I couldn't stop thinking about what else might be hidden down there. Was there something I'd missed? Another clue that could tie all of this together? The more I thought about it, the more restless I became. By the end of the week, I'd made up my mind. I packed the same bag I'd taken the first time. Flashlight, portable charger, snacks, water, all the essentials. But this time, I also brought a notebook and a better camera. If I was going back, I was going to document everything as thoroughly as possible. The drive to the forest felt longer than I remembered, but that was probably because I was overthinking the entire trip. By the time I reached the trailhead and parked my car, it was late morning. I figured I had plenty of daylight to explore, so I grabbed my bag and headed into the woods. The door to the facility was still there, exactly as I'd left it. Part of me had expected it to be gone, sealed up, or barricaded. Anything to prove that I wasn't supposed to be there. But no, it was just sitting there, rusted and overgrown like it had been for decades. I took a deep breath, pushed it open, and started down the staircase. The upper levels were exactly the same as before, dusty, cold, and silent. I moved quickly through the rooms I'd already explored, barely stopping to glance at the old machines and filing cabinets. My goal this time was to go deeper, to see if there were any areas I'd missed on my first visit. When I reached the lower level, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The narrow corridor, the laboratory, the storage room, it was all just as I'd remembered. But this time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the far end of the corridor, past the row of sealed pods, there was another door. It was smaller than the others, almost hidden in the shadows. The first time I'd been here, I must have walked right past it without even realizing it was there. The door was locked, but the lock itself was old and brittle. A few hard pulls and it snapped right off. Behind the door was yet another staircase, but this one was even steeper than the others. The walls were lined with pipes and the air smelled damp and metallic, like old water. As I descended, I couldn't help but feel like I was entering the heart of the facility. The deeper I went, the more it felt like this was where everything had really happened. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a massive underground chamber. The ceiling was high and the walls were lined with more of those strange panels I'd seen earlier. But the centerpiece of the room was what caught my attention. A large circular platform surrounded by metal consoles and wires. The platform reminded me of something you'd see in a sci-fi movie, like a teleportation pad or a machine designed to harness energy. It was covered in strange markings, some of which glowed faintly in the dim light. I had no idea what it was supposed to do, but it was clear that this was the facility's main focus. I walked around the platform, taking pictures from every angle. The consoles surrounding it were covered in dials, switches, and screens, all of which were dark and lifeless. But there was something odd about the way they were positioned. It was almost like they were designed to monitor something, to record data from whatever happened on the platform. On one of the consoles, I found a stack of papers tucked beneath a layer of dust. Most of them were incomprehensible, filled with mathematical equations and technical schematics. But one page stood out. It was a single sheet of paper with a hand-drawn diagram of the platform, surrounded by notes written in German. I took a photo and later translated it with Evan's help. The notes mentioned something called Wellenübertragung, which translates to wave transmission. It also referenced the conduit again, describing it as a bridge between dimensions. Dimensions? That was new. Up until now, I'd been operating under the assumption that this facility was focused on psychic abilities, telekinesis, hypnosis, mind control. But if the notes were accurate, the experiments had gone far beyond that. They weren't just trying to enhance the human mind, they were trying to connect it to something else, something outside of our reality. The implications were a lot to process. I tried to push the thought aside and focus on what was in front of me. As I continued searching the room, I noticed another small console tucked away in the corner. Unlike the others, this one had a power switch that still seemed intact. Against my better judgment, I flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, the console flickered to life. The screen glowed faintly, displaying lines of text in German. I didn't recognize most of the words, but one line stood out. Energiezufuhr unzureichend. Aktivierung fehlgeschlagen. Later, Evan would translate it for me. Insufficient power supply. Activation failed. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. On one hand, I didn't really want to find out what that platform was capable of. On the other hand, I felt like I'd hit a dead end. If the machine couldn't be activated, what was the point of all this? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I took a few more pictures of the room, then made my way back up the stairs. I decided I'd seen enough for one day. That was my last visit to the facility. Since then, I've spent countless hours going through the documents, trying to piece together the story of what happened there. Evan has been a huge help, but even he admits there are too many gaps in the puzzle. From what we can tell, the facility was part of Project Shadowmind, an international effort to study and weaponize psychic phenomena during World War I. The experiments focused on pushing the limits of the human brain, with the ultimate goal of creating a conduit capable of connecting to something. Whether that something was another dimension, a higher plane of existence, or just an abstract concept, we don't know. What we do know is that the program didn't end when the war did. The documents suggest that the experiments continued in secret for decades, possibly under new names and new leadership. But at some point, the facility was abandoned, left to decay in the middle of nowhere. I don't know why it was shut down. Maybe the experiments failed, or maybe they succeeded in ways the scientists didn't anticipate. Either way, the facility remains a relic of a forgotten time, a reminder of humanity's constant desire to push the boundaries of what's possible. As for me, I haven't been back since that second visit. I still think about it sometimes, though. About the glowing platform, the strange documents, and the figure in the pod. Part of me wonders if I should have left it all alone, if I poked my nose into something I wasn't meant to see. But another part of me can't help but feel like this isn't the end of the story, and I have to say sorry for my pathetic German reading. So this all started because of a really dumb impulse, like, what was I even thinking? Levels of dumb. I've always been fascinated by weird internet lore, the kind of stuff you'd find in a late-night Reddit thread or some shady YouTube video. You know, those rabbit holes that lead you to stuff like cursed websites, strange forums, or urban legends about the dark web. It's probably from all the creepypasta I read in high school. Anyway, it wasn't like I planned to actually do anything. It started as a joke. A few weeks ago, I was hanging out with a couple of friends in a Discord call. We were all bored, swapping dumb TikToks, talking about AI, and watching YouTube videos. Somehow the topic drifted to the dark web. My friend Jordan started bragging about how easy it is to access, saying all you need is the Tor browser and a decent VPN. Of course, we dared him to prove it, but he was all talk. Still, it planted a seed in my head. That night, after everyone logged off, I decided to try it for myself. Not because I'm some tech genius or anything. I just wanted to see what it was actually like. I downloaded the Tor browser, set up a VPN, and found myself staring at a completely different internet. It felt wrong, but also kind of thrilling, like I'd opened a door to a part of the world I was never meant to see. Most of it was honestly boring. Lots of sketchy marketplace pages selling fake passports, counterfeit money, and God knows what else. I wasn't stupid enough to click on anything, except for this one link that caught my eye. It just said, "The Bazaar of Numbers." Curiosity got the better of me. The site looked like a relic from the early 2000s, plain black background, red text, and a flashing banner that said, "Own a piece of history. Buy a phone number with a story." At first, I assumed it was just some kind of weird art project or scam. The homepage explained that each number was haunted or had some kind of paranormal significance. They were supposedly linked to unsolved crimes, urban legends, or energies. Most of them were overpriced nonsense, like $5,000 for a number supposedly linked to the Zodiac Killer. But then I saw one that was oddly cheap. It was listed for $30, and the description just said, "They call at the same time every day. It knows your voice." I sat there staring at the screen, debating if I should do it. I wasn't scared. I didn't even believe in the paranormal. I figured it was some kind of prank number or pre-recorded gag, like those old soundboards you'd find online. But for $30, that's like 2 Starbucks drinks. I convinced myself it'd be funny to mess with my friends. I bought it. The transaction was sketchy as hell. The site only accepted Bitcoin, so I had to figure out how to set up a wallet, convert some money, and transfer it to an address that looked like a random string of nonsense. A few minutes after paying, I got an email with a single sentence. +1 324 573 2320 will be active tomorrow at 10 p.m. No instructions, no explanations, just the number. The next day, I completely forgot about it until around 9:45 p.m. I was scrolling through Instagram, half watching a Netflix series in the background, when I remembered the email. I added the number to my contacts, labeling it cursed number as a joke. I set my phone on the desk and waited. At exactly 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. The screen lit up. Incoming call from cursed number. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some creepy breathing or a robotic voice saying 7 days like in The Ring. What I didn't expect was my own voice. Hello? It was me. Or at least it sounded like me. The tone, the inflection, everything was identical, down to the slight awkwardness in how I answer calls. Hello? I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. For a second, there was silence. Then it repeated, hello? It was like someone had recorded me and was playing it back. But here's the thing. I had never said that into a phone. I could tell because the way it said hello was weirdly specific, like I was trying to get someone's attention in a crowded room. I hung up. For the next 10 minutes, I sat there staring at my phone, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as a prank. Maybe the site had some kind of voice matching software, but how could they replicate my voice so perfectly? The next day I went about my business as usual. Work was uneventful, and I spent my lunch break doom-scrolling Twitter like I always do. By the time I got home, I'd almost convinced myself that the call was just a one-off thing. Maybe the number wouldn't even work again. But at 10 p.m., right on the dot, it rang. This time I hesitated before answering. What if I just let it go to voicemail? But then my curiosity got the better of me. I picked up, and before I could say anything, I heard my voice again. Are you there? I froze. Are you there? It repeated. It didn't sound like a recording this time. There was something different, like it was trying to have a conversation with me. I hung up again, my hands shaking. By day 3, the calls weren't just unsettling, they were disturbing. That night, when I picked up, it wasn't just my voice anymore. It was my mom's. Why haven't you called me? It caught me so off guard that I almost dropped the phone. My mom passed away 5 years ago. Why haven't you called me? The voice repeated. I hung up, and this time I turned my phone off completely. I should have stopped there. I should have deleted the number and moved on with my life. But something about those calls, it wasn't just creepy. It felt intentional, like the number was trying to tell me something. I decided to keep answering. That's when things got worse. The next few nights blurred together, but one thing stayed the same. The calls kept coming. Always at 10 p.m. Always from that number. I started to notice a pattern. Each time I answered, it wasn't just my voice anymore. It was someone I knew, someone I had lost. The fourth night, it was my grandpa. He passed away when I was 12, and hearing his voice again felt like a punch to the chest. He used to call me kiddo, and that's exactly what he said when I picked up. Kiddo, you need to listen to me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Are you listening, kiddo? I hung up. After that call, I stopped sleeping properly. I didn't want to tell anyone. I mean, how do you even explain something like this without sounding insane? Hey, so I bought a haunted phone number on the dark web, and now I'm getting calls from dead relatives. Yeah, that was a hard no. I figured if I brought it up, my friends would either laugh it off or worse, think I was losing it. But the thing is, it wasn't just the voices, it was the way they talked. They all spoke like they were trying to tell me something. Like there was something I needed to hear, but I kept hanging up before they could say it. On the fifth night, the call was different. At 10 p.m., my phone lit up as usual. By now, I had this routine where I'd just stare at the screen for a few seconds, debating whether or not to answer. This time, I let it ring until the last possible second before swiping to pick up. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaking just enough to make me cringe at myself. There was a long pause, and then, "It's me, Noah." It took me a second to process the name. Noah was my best friend from middle school. We hadn't spoken in years, not since he moved away. I found out through Facebook last year that he had died in a car accident. "I don't have much time," the voice said. I swear my heart stopped. The voice sounded exactly like him. I don't mean close enough or kind of similar. It was him. I even recognized the little rasp he used to have when he talked too fast. "You need to listen," he continued. "It's important." This time I didn't hang up. What do you want?" I asked. There was another long pause, and then he said something that gave me actual goosebumps. Not the cheap horror movie kind, but the kind you get when someone tells you something you weren't ready to hear. "It's not just me. We're all trying to reach you." Before I could respond, the call disconnected. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. "We're all trying to reach you." Who was we, and why me? I started digging through the internet, trying to find any clues about the number. I searched Reddit, obscure forums, even Quora, any place where someone might have had a similar experience. But nothing came up. Every mention of haunted phone numbers just led me to urban legends, fake ghost stories, and spam websites. The only place I hadn't checked was the original site where I bought the number, but when I tried to access it, the link was dead. It just gave me a 404 not found error. Figures. By the seventh night, the calls were all I could think about. I barely touched my phone during the day, afraid that it might start ringing at a different time, but it never did. That was almost worse, knowing it would only ever ring at 10 p.m., like clockwork. It was a countdown I couldn't escape. When the call came that night, I answered immediately. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. "What do you want from me?" This time, the voice wasn't anyone I recognized. It was deeper, more monotone, but still eerily familiar, like a warped version of my own voice. "You asked for this." "I didn't ask for anything," I shot back. "You bought the number." I froze. It wasn't wrong. I did buy it, but I didn't expect whatever this was. "Why is this happening?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and then it said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "It's a door." "What do you mean, a door?" I demanded. But the call cut off before I could get an answer. After that, I stopped answering the calls. I thought maybe if I ignored them, they'd stop on their own. But the thing is, they didn't. Every night, the phone rang, and every night I let it go to voicemail. What was even stranger was that the voicemails weren't just recordings of the calls I didn't pick up. They were completely different. They'd say things I'd never heard during the live calls. One voicemail said, "It's already open." Another said, "You can't stop it." And then there was the one that really messed me up. It was my dad's voice. My dad is still alive. "Why won't you answer me, son?" I listened to that one over and over, trying to figure out if it was really him. It sounded like him, but not exactly. There was something off about it. Like it wasn't a recording of him, but someone trying to be him. By this point, I was desperate. I wanted to block the number, but no matter how many times I tried, it wouldn't let me. My phone just froze every time I hit block contact. I even tried factory resetting my phone, but somehow the number was still there when it rebooted. I thought about getting rid of my phone entirely, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like, I don't know, giving up? Like if I didn't figure this out, I'd regret it. I needed answers. So I made the one choice I hadn't tried yet. The next night, I decided to pick up the call and stay on the line, no matter what I heard. When the clock struck 9:59 p.m. on the 8th night, I sat in my room with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen like I was waiting for a bomb to go off. The air felt heavier somehow, maybe from the anticipation or from knowing what I'd committed myself to. Tonight I wasn't going to hang up. No matter what I heard, I was going to stay on the line and try to get answers. At exactly 10 p.m., the phone buzzed. Incoming call from cursed number. I answered it immediately, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. At first, there was silence. Not the static kind of silence you get on a bad connection. This was complete silence, like the line itself wasn't real. Then a voice spoke. "We need to talk." It was my voice again, but not like the other times. This one sounded older, more serious, almost like I was speaking to a version of myself from the future. "Talk about what?" I asked. The voice paused before answering. "The number. It's not just a number, it's a way in." "A way into what?" "To us," it replied. That didn't make any sense. What does that even mean? Who's us? "You already know," the voice said. "You've heard us." I thought back to all the other calls. My mom, my grandpa, Noah, even my dad's voice in the voicemail. "You mean the people who've called me? They're all waiting," it interrupted. That sentence sent a chill down my spine, but I kept my composure. "Waiting for what?" "To see if you'll listen," the voice said. "But there are rules. If you don't follow them, it won't stop." Finally, I was getting something concrete. "What rules?" I asked. The line crackled slightly before the voice replied. "You've already broken one. Never hang up once you've answered." I swallowed hard. "Another rule," it continued. "Never let it go to voicemail." "So, what? I just answer every call and stay on the line forever?" I asked, my frustration leaking through. "No," the voice said firmly. "You answer. You listen. And when it's done, you wait for the next one. That's the only way." "But why me?" I asked. "I didn't sign up for this." "You bought the number," the voice said flatly. "You opened the door." I wanted to scream. This wasn't fair. How was I supposed to know what I was getting into? It was just some random website on the dark web. None of this should have been real. Before I could say anything else, the voice added one final warning. "Don't try to stop the calls. Don't try to block the number. And whatever you do, don't involve anyone else. You'll make it worse." The call ended abruptly. For a while, I just sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what I'd just heard. Rules? A door? Waiting for me to listen? It sounded like some kind of twisted game, but I wasn't even sure who or what I was playing against. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours scrolling through my phone, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. But everything I found was useless, just more fake stories, urban legends, and wild theories. I thought about breaking the rules just to see what would happen, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if the voice was right? What if breaking the rules made things worse? The next night at 10 p.m. sharp, the call came again. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. "Hello?" This time it wasn't my voice on the other end. It wasn't anyone I recognized either. It sounded like a little girl. "Why don't you come play with me?" she said, her voice light and playful, like she was skipping rope or playing hopscotch. I didn't know how to respond. "Who are you?" "Don't you remember me?" she asked. "No, I stopped mid-sentence. Something about her voice did seem familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Come play with me," she said again, giggling softly. "It's fun here. You'll like it." I wanted to ask more questions, but the call ended before I could. That night, I dreamed about her. Or at least I think I did. It was one of those dreams that feels too real, where you wake up questioning whether it actually happened. I was standing in a field surrounded by fog, and in the distance, I could see a small figure skipping toward me. She was holding a jump rope, humming a tune I couldn't recognize. When she got closer, I realized she wasn't a stranger. She was someone I used to know. Her name was Emily, and she lived down the street from me when I was a kid. She used to invite me to play tag or hide and seek after school, but one day she just stopped showing up. My parents told me her family moved away, but years later, I found out she'd died in a house fire. In the dream, she stopped a few feet in front of me and smiled. "Why won't you play with me?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely. Before I could respond, I woke up in a cold sweat. The next day, I felt like a zombie at work. I couldn't focus on anything except the calls, the rules, and what they might mean. Were all of these voices somehow connected to me? And if so, why were they reaching out now? That night, I decided to record the call. I didn't know if it would work. Maybe the number had some kind of supernatural way of blocking recordings, but I had to try. At 10 p.m., the phone rang. "Hello?" I said, hitting the record button on my laptop at the same time. This time, the voice on the other end was my sister. "I miss you," she said softly. My chest tightened. My sister was alive and well. We'd just FaceTimed a few days ago. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "You're not listening," she replied, her voice growing fainter. "I am listening," I said, almost shouting. "I've been listening this whole time." "No," she whispered. "Not to us. To yourself." And then the line went dead. When I checked the recording afterward, the file was empty. After the call ended that night, I sat there staring at the recording software on my laptop, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The fact that the file was empty made my stomach twist. I'd hit record. I watched the little red light blinking the entire time, but when I hit playback, there was nothing, just silence. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just smash my phone to pieces and be done with it, but the voice from the second call still haunted me. "You bought the number. You opened the door." It didn't feel like I could just walk away from this anymore. The message from the last call stuck with me too. "You're not listening. Not to us. To yourself." What did that even mean? I was listening. I had been listening to all of them. But now it felt like they were trying to tell me something deeper, something I wasn't understanding. I spent most of the next day trying to piece it together. If this number was a door, like the earlier call had said, then what exactly had I let in? Or what had I let out? That evening, I decided to take a different approach. If the rules were to listen and not let the calls go to voicemail, then maybe I needed to do more than just listen. Maybe I needed to respond, really engage with them. At exactly 10 p.m., the phone rang again. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound calm. This time, the voice was someone I hadn't expected. My old piano teacher, Mrs. Carver. She passed away when I was 16, and I hadn't thought about her in years. But the moment I heard her voice, I was transported back to her living room, sitting on that wobbly piano bench while she gently scolded me for not practicing enough. "Have you been practicing?" she asked, her voice warm but firm, just like I remembered. "Practicing what?" I asked, confused. "What I taught you," she replied. "You remember, don't you?" I hesitated. I hadn't touched a piano in over a decade. I don't think I do." There was a pause on the other end, and then she said something that made my heart skip. "Then why did you call me?" "I didn't," I blurted out. "You called me." "No," she said gently. "You called us." The line went dead. After that call, I started noticing other strange things I couldn't explain. For one, my phone started acting weird. Apps would crash for no reason. Text messages I'd sent earlier in the day would randomly disappear from my inbox. Even my wallpaper changed on its own. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, but then I noticed something. The new wallpaper was an image I hadn't seen in years. It was a photo of me as a kid, sitting at Mrs. Carver's piano. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, trying to remember where that photo had even come from. It wasn't on my phone before. I hadn't uploaded it to any social media. The only place I knew it existed was in an old photo album buried somewhere in my parents' attic. The next night, I decided to test something. If these calls were really tied to my past, maybe the number was accessing things I'd forgotten, things I hadn't thought about in years. I started going through old boxes in my closet, digging out anything I could find. Yearbooks, journals, photos, anything that might connect to the voices I'd been hearing. That's when I found it. At the bottom of a dusty shoebox, I came across an old cassette tape labeled, "For You." I didn't remember ever seeing it before, but my name was written on it in shaky handwriting. There was no date, no explanation, just those 2 words. I didn't even own a cassette player anymore, so I spent the next hour driving around to thrift stores until I finally found one. When I got home, I popped the tape in and hit play. At first, there was nothing but static. I almost thought it was blank, but then I heard it. A faint melody, played on a piano. It was the song Mrs. Carver used to make me practice every week. I'd forgotten all about it until now. The melody played for about a minute before a voice broke through the static. "We've been waiting." It wasn't Mrs. Carver's voice. It wasn't my mom, my grandpa, Noah, or anyone else I recognized. It was my voice, but not quite. It sounded distant, fainter, like it was coming from far away. The tape cut off after that, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. The calls that night felt different. I didn't even wait for the usual 10 p.m. ring. At 9:59, I unlocked my phone and stared at the screen, waiting for it to light up. When the call came, I answered immediately. "Hello? You found it," the voice said. "Found what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The tape," it replied. "It's part of the door." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "Why is this happening to me? What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it said, "Do you remember the song?" I froze. "You need to play it," the voice continued. "That's the key." "I don't have a piano," I said automatically, though I wasn't sure why that was my first response. "You'll find one," the voice said simply. And then the call ended. That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea of playing that song, it felt like a trap, but it also felt like the only way forward. I didn't know why the number had chosen me, or what it wanted, but I was starting to feel like I didn't have a choice. The next day I drove to my parents' house. They still had the old upright piano in the living room, though it hadn't been tuned in years. When I sat down in front of it, my hands hovered over the keys, hesitant. It had been so long since I'd played, but as soon as I started, it all came flooding back. The melody was simple, repetitive, almost hypnotic. As I played, I felt something strange, a pull, like the song was unlocking something deep inside me. And then, halfway through the song, my phone buzzed. I stopped playing and checked the screen. It wasn't 10 p.m. yet, but the cursed number was calling me. This time I let it ring. The call wasn't supposed to come early. For 8 nights it had rung at exactly 10 p.m., never a minute before or after. But this time it was 3:47 p.m. I stared at my phone, unsure whether I should pick it up. This felt different, wrong somehow. But maybe it was because I had started playing the song. I hesitated, but then I remembered the rules. Don't let it go to voicemail. I answered. "Hello?" For a moment, there was no response. Then a voice came through, faint but unmistakable. It was my mom again. "Why did you stop playing?" she asked, her tone soft but disappointed. I didn't think it mattered," I stammered. "What's the point of all this? What does the song even do?" "It's not just a song," she said. "It's a key, but you have to finish it." "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice trembling. The line crackled, and for a second, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, she said, "You'll stay." "Stay where?" I asked, my heart pounding. But the call ended before she could explain. That night I sat in front of the piano for hours, staring at the keys. I didn't want to finish the song. Something about it felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But if I didn't play it, what would happen? Would I be stuck in this endless cycle of calls forever? At exactly 10 p.m. the phone rang again. I picked it up without hesitation this time. "Are you ready to finish it?" the voice asked. It wasn't my mom this time. It wasn't my grandpa or Noah or anyone else I knew. It was me. Not the same version of me I'd heard in earlier calls. This one sounded distant, like it was coming from the other side of a wall. "Why does it have to be me?" I asked. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" "Because you opened the door," the voice said, echoing the same phrase I'd heard before. "And now it's up to you to close it." "How?" "Finish the song," it said simply. "What happens if I do?" I asked. There was a long pause, and then the voice said something that chilled me to my core. "You already know." And then the call ended. I didn't play the song that night, or the next night, or the night after that. The calls kept coming, every single night at 10 p.m., but I stopped answering them. I knew I was breaking the rules, but I didn't care. I couldn't bring myself to finish the song, and I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. At first, nothing changed. The calls would ring for a while and then go to voicemail, just like before. But the voicemails were getting stranger. Instead of voices I recognized, they were filled with faint whispers and odd, rhythmic tapping sounds, almost like someone was playing the piano but with random notes that didn't make sense. And then, on the 15th night, I noticed something else. When I woke up the next morning, my phone had a notification for a voicemail from the cursed number. That wasn't new. But this time, it wasn't just one voicemail, it was dozens. I opened my voicemail inbox and scrolled through the list. Every single one was from the same number, all time-stamped at 10 p.m. the night before. There were over 40 of them, all marked as unplayed. I hesitated for a long time before finally pressing play on the first one. At first it was just static, but then faintly I heard the song. The same song Mrs. Carver had taught me. It was being played slowly, one note at a time, like someone was trying to teach it to me all over again. The second voicemail was the same, so was the third, and the fourth. By the time I reached the 10th message, I realized what they were doing. They were playing the song for me, forcing me to finish it, note by note, even if I didn't want to. That night I sat at the piano again. I didn't answer the call when it came. I didn't even look at my phone. Instead, I placed my hands on the keys and started playing. The melody came easier this time, like I wasn't even thinking about it. My fingers moved on their own, hitting each note with perfect precision. The song built slowly, climbing toward a crescendo I didn't remember ever learning. And then, as I hit the final note, something happened. The room went completely silent. Not just quiet, but silent, like the air itself had been sucked out. I couldn't even hear the hum of the fridge in the next room or the faint buzz of the streetlights outside. And then I felt it. A presence. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. When I finally looked at my phone, the cursed number was gone. Not just blocked or deleted. It was like it had never been there. My call log was empty. My voicemail inbox was clear, and the contact I had saved as cursed number had disappeared completely. For the first time in weeks, I thought it was over. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something on my desk. It was the cassette tape. The same one I'd found in the shoebox, the one I'd played just days ago. But this time the label was different. Instead of "for you," it now said, "Keep listening." I haven't touched it since. I don't know if the door is closed or if it's still open. I don't even know what was on the other side or why the calls started in the first place. All I know is that sometimes late at night, I'll hear faint tapping sounds, like piano keys, coming from somewhere in the house. And every time I hear it, I wonder, did I really finish the song? Or did it finish me?